nervous. So I think I'm going to start. And I'm going to start just by asking you a question, really. How many of you have seen more than 5 Almodóvar films? Okay, not that many.
Please, into the mic.
So, yeah.
Speaking,
Yeah. Thank you. So not that many. So it's good to know because when Jan asked me to do these 2 talks, I thought it would be good to have an introductory talk to Almodóvar, on his career and the various contexts. I assumed that people would be familiar with the career, but maybe less so with the context, and then the next lecture would be a kind of an in-depth lecture of, an hour and a half talking about one film. Because I think what I want to convey is that he is a very great filmmaker, and very great filmmakers lend themselves to, kind of many hours of exploration. So that's the plan. I'm going to be talking for about an hour. I want to have about a half hour of discussion. I'm sure you all have kind of questions or things you want to discuss. If you don't, I will continue and, show you some clips, and we can kind of try to get a discussion going on what his cinema is like, But first of all, I want to start with the career, really. And I want to start with this image because it's an image of Almodóvar as punk. It's taken in the early 1980s. It became the cover of a book of photographs documenting this period in Madrid life, which was the period of the Movida, and of which he was a central member of. I chose the image because when I've traveled to Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Argentina, this is kind of an image that you see all over young queer people's bedrooms. He's become kind of, an inspiration, really, in relation to ways of being. So to me, he's a very fascinating director because on the one hand, he comes from the underground, he's associated with the marginal, and yet he is as mainstream can be. He is the most financially successful European film director. Yes, his films have all made money. There hasn't been a single failure amongst them, right? And this has been going on now for about 40 years. So this idea that, you're both associated with the marginal, but also absolutely as mainstream as you can get, yes, is a kind of, I would say, one of Almodóvar's great successes, that kind of those things come together in his body of work. All right. So, I want to start with a few words about his first film. Have any of you seen it? Hands up. A few, 2, 3. It's a fascinating film. It was kind of made privately. So I think it's important to say that Almodóvar comes from a rural peasant background. At a time when in Spain, that was a real difference. Spain was under a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship, and it was very poor. Yes, between kind of 1960 and 1964, I think over 2 million people emigrated from Spain abroad, my parents being one of those people, right? It's like Poland a decade ago. You had these mass migrations of people. Education was only available up to a certain level. It was largely private. It was often provided by religious institutions. So Almodóvar, if you see Pain and Glory, you get a bit of that story. His mother maneuvered a scholarship for him in a religious institution, partly because he had a very beautiful voice. So Almodóvar got an education, a high school education, no more than that. And after his high school education, he got a job as a clerk working at the National Telephone Company, right? And he continued to work at the National Film Company until he began making Law of Desire. So he made 5 films while still working for the National Telephone Company, right? In the later years, he would take a leave of absence and return, But, the insecurity of not having a government job, a civil service job, however lowly paid it was, is a concern. There's a kind of a real, you can tell he is somebody from a peasant's background, And it's important because in these days in Spain, in those days in Spain, to be a filmmaker meant to be at least middle class, if not upper middle class. Yeah, you need an education. There was a national film school. Only certain people had access to kind of the possibilities of filmmaking. And rural peasants were definitely not amongst them, right? So I think for me, Almodóvar's first initial success was to be making films at all. Yeah? He is unique amongst his generation. He's the only person from that background who made films. And you can hear the background in all of his films because, you know, one of the things that is very difficult to catch in translation is he's got a beautiful ear for dialogue. Yeah, kind of, you know, I listen to his characters speak and I hear my family, my aunts, the way they speak to each other. Yeah, and he's funny and so on. So, and you know, you don't hear people talking like that kind of anywhere else, really. And I think that is largely from that particular background, which is important to recognize. Pepe Lucy Bom, on another level, it's a comic film. It was made in weekends and evenings with private money, right? But I think significantly, and something that you might want to keep in mind for the rest of his work, is it begins with a rape. Yeah? So Carmen Maura plays this middle-class girl who, in typical Almodóvar humor, is saving her virginity to sell it to the highest bidder so that she can get her independence from her parents, right? And what happens is a corrupt cop comes in because she has a marijuana plant in her window and rapes her. And then the rest of the film is about her getting vengeance for the rape, right? But I think it's also very significant that Almodóvar's first film begins with a rape. Because, you know, it's hard to think of an Almodóvar film that doesn't have a rape, yeah? It's you know, I think he's the person who has treated that subject in so many different ways, some of which I think would not be permissible today. Yeah, Kika has a whole extended scene. It's like an aria. Yeah, this porn actor escapes from jail, rapes Veronica Forqué, and it's all played for comedy. Yeah, and he gets the laughs. Yeah, it's unimaginable today. I've shown it to students. It still works, right? But the idea of dramatizing that for comedy is, well, unthinkable now, right? And quite extraordinary to see. And of course, he's done it in many ways, right? So those of you who saw Talk to Her, right, in the middle of the film, there is an extended rape, yeah? It's by this person who you think is a very nice man. Yeah, it's kind of shown to you through the visualization of a 1920s silent film, but there's no clear, it's very absolutely clear that there was no consent. She's in a coma, right? She can't give consent, right? So he's a rapist, yes? And yet Almodóvar garners some sympathy for the man who committed that rape. In other films, it's, you know, the priests rape boys, yeah, kind of in Bad Education. It's like he's dramatized almost every possible permutation of rape and its effects, yeah, and people's responses to it across gender, right? Because you can also see a film like The Skin I Live In, you know, as a heterosexual rape. Yeah, a heterosexual man is raped of his sex and his gender in the film. Yeah, I hope that's not a spoiler. But yeah, just to show that from the very first scene in the film, you get variations, reworkings, redramatizations. It's placed for comedy, it's placed for tears. Yeah, it's kind of made into ethical and moral dilemmas of various kinds. Yeah, it's quite extraordinary to see that in the very first film. Okay, so Almodóvar is now so famous that you can do Star Wars parodies of his film posters. I think quite extraordinary for a Spanish filmmaker. But I want to set some of the context that the work arises from, right? So Almodóvar begins making films in the period immediately after Franco died in 1975, yeah? and a new constitution comes in. It's a period called the period of the transition to democracy, right? So I want you to keep that in mind because it's a very unstable period, right? Kind of, we now look at the past and we say, okay, well, democracy won out, right? But there was no guarantee that it would, right? So he begins making these very transgressive, very daring, very in-your-face films at a moment where that could have had real personal cost, yeah? And a sign of that is just, what the censorship norms were in the period that predated. So, these were the things that were forbidden in the cinema just before the censorship norms were changed in '78. So you can't show suicide and mercy killing, vengeance and violence as a means of solving social and human problems, prostitution, sexual perversion, adultery, and illicit sexual relations. All the topics of Almodóvar cinema are forbidden, yeah? Just in that period, just before. And this is kind of an absolutely archetypal example of Francoist censorship. This is the poster of Rita Hayworth in a fair in Trinidad, which I think is 1953, right? This is what the censor changed it to, yeah, because I don't know if you can see, but there's too much décolleté. You can see too much of Rita Hayworth's breasts. So that was the proposal, and this is what the poster ended up being, right? And part of the difficulty of these censorship norms, like you see in any totalitarian regime, is that there's no rules. Yeah, so there are norms, but someone can say, yes, you can do this, and then someone can say, no, that's absolutely forbidden, and you have no recourse, right? Kind of, that is the way that kind of power works in those regimes. So this is the context in which kind of Almodóvar is coming from. Yeah. Now, I want to mention in the late 70s, early 80s, yeah, in this period of the transition, Franco had died, and there was a real upsurge of youth culture, yeah? So kind of young people felt that they'd been deprived of what was available in European culture, right? And there was an aspect of pushing the limits, and both in terms of representation and in terms of personal lifestyle. One of the tragedies that this led to was, that because drug taking seemed so modern, so European, had been so forbidden, yeah, kind of what you have in Madrid in the early 80s is an epidemic of deaths due to heroin, yeah? So this freeing up of the culture, which was so sudden. On the one hand, in cinema, in 1978, I think, 8 of the top 10 hits were porn, right? It had been forbidden before, so you had Black Emmanuel, the Anti-Virgin, The Story of O. Yeah, people were flocking to see that because it had not been possible before, right? This again also quieted down, yeah, but this is the period that I'm talking about in which Almodóvar is making his first films. He's part of a group of people who work in advertising, who are painters, who are musicians. Yeah, this is Costus, a gay couple who painted together. What you see on the right here is one of their murals, and in fact, if you look at Labyrinth of Passion, this is also the set for one of Almodóvar, yeah, for Labyrinth of Passion. It was actually the apartment of this couple. There were many others and many famous ones. So Fanny McNamara was one. And most importantly, Alaska, who participated in his first film, who's a kind of, a national treasure now of Spanish cinema. She was in many bands, including Fangoria. That's her biography over there on the right. And all of these musicians were in Almodóvar's first films, yeah, primarily Pepe and Labyrinth of Passion. And what happened, of course, is that most of them are now dead. Yeah, they died either from the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s or through heroin, right? So these early films, aside from, you know, what they represent and, you know, kind of the fun they are and the challenge and, yeah, they're also a record of this group of people who contributed so much and so briefly, yeah, to this culture, yeah, but that are now kind of long dead. They all appear in these films as musicians, as actors, or contributing art or posters. Amongst them is Carlos Berlanga, who did the poster you see here for Matador, who was also a very, very famous musician and is considered, you know, a poet, yeah? His lyrics to these songs are very beautiful. And as you can see, he died in 2002. Along with this grouping of people, Almodóvar became a kind of a star of Madrid nightlife. Yeah, so, you know, kind of, we're not used to thinking of directors as stars. I mean, they might be famous, but Almodóvar actually was a kind of a star. Yeah, he made records. Yeah, kind of. Again, you can see he's in drag, singing "Suck It to Me" with McNamara. He was writing short stories that were published, Patti di Fusta and other texts. He was contributing stories for comic books, underground kind of semi-porn comic books. And all of this you see kind of evident in his very first film. Again, to kind of tell a little bit of the trajectory of this film, it's a film that was privately made on a tiny budget, yeah, partly personally and partly borrowing money from family. Carmen Maura, the lead actress, contributed some of the budget, right? It's a real kind of homemade affair, right? But then the film became an enormous underground success. Yeah, a little bit, I don't know if you've had this phenomenon here of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Yeah, where you have midnight screenings and people dress up and, yeah. So that, it played for 3 years in midnight screenings at the Alphaville Cinema. And it was such a success that the Alphaville Cinema financed Labyrinth of Passion. And just have a look at that poster where so many things had been forbidden just 5 years previously. Yeah, and all of a sudden you can have a vagina dentata, yeah, in a film poster, right? So the intent was very much to shock, to convey something new, and to convey some of the fun of the Madrid nightlife. So this was financed by the Alphaville Cinema, and the success of this, in turn, led to Entre Tinieblas, Dark Hideout. Tesauro is the production company. It was kind of a relatively small but professional production company. And really, the producer financed it so that his girlfriend, Cristina Pascual, could have the lead role as a bolero singer. Yeah? It's very, in a Catholic country, it's very outrageous, yes? You know, one of the nuns is a lesbian, the other one takes heroin, yeah, kind of, the other one writes pornography and the best-selling and so on, right? And I think this element of being both shocking, right, but also kind of finding something human in all of these women is very characteristic of Almodóvar cinema. The next one in this period is What Have I Done to Deserve This? How many of you saw this in the screening the other day? Only a few of you? Okay. Too bad. It's a combination of neorealist cinema, yeah, and queer camp, in-your-face corrosiveness, basically, right? So it's about this housewife who's completely downtrodden, who doesn't have enough money to feed her children, whose husband is a very stereotypical fascist macho, right? She ends up killing him with a ham bone, yeah? And who has to find a way of kind of continuing to live in spite of these really terrible economic conditions. One of the things that you see in the film, let me Okay. One of the things that you see in the film is how he begins to have a whole series of actors that, like Hollywood studios of the classic era, you know, that you could immediately tell whether the film was an MGM film or a Paramount film by who the tiny bit actors or supporting actors were, as well as the stars, obviously. You can tell that in Almodóvar's films, because Almodóvar's films are a combination of relationships with stars, who often give their very best performances for him. Carmen Maura is beautiful in this film, yeah, as this downtrodden housewife. But he also has his mother. Yeah, that's his mother in the center. And she appears in all of his films until he dies. Yeah, often in very surprising ways. Yeah, so and I forget, is it Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down? In one of his later films, she reads the national news. Yeah, yeah. So again, you have like this rural peasant women all wearing black. Yeah, reading the national news. It's partly a joke, yeah, which works as a joke, but it's also part of what he does, of bringing in people who convey a kind of a raw quality of speech, associations with various kind of sectors of the population that are not just actors, whilst actually valuing actors enough so that you hire the very best actors, yeah, Antonio Banderas, Javier Bardem, yeah, the creme de la creme of Spanish cinema has worked in his films. And of course, they do all the heavy lifting of, you know, personifying, conveying emotion, expressing emotion. But then all of the minor characters are people by his friends or his relatives. Yeah, and in fact, he's got a signature, which is his brother, who subsequently became producer of all his films. But his brother does a little Hitchcock-like cameo in every single one of his films, yeah? So if you're a real fan of Almodóvar, you follow his work, you come to recognize these moments where his brother appears. And of course, you know, his brother has gone from being a 20-year-old in Pepe, yeah, trying to pick up a prostitute in the cinema, to being a middle-aged, yeah, fat, old guy, yeah, in his later films, yeah? So kind of you can trace a whole kind of development of a culture and of a sensibility through his films. Let me backtrack a little bit. So What Have I Done to Deserve This is very significant because it's also the film that made an impression abroad. The film, What Have I Done to Deserve This, was shown at the New York Film Festival. It was a big success there, and it led to a video distribution deal. Now, you know, many of you are too young to remember this, but the coming of video absolutely transformed the kinds of films that were made. Yeah, kind of video cassettes and the market for video cassettes and video rentals are what made possible you know, the cinema of Spike Lee, or women's cinema, or even literary adaptations, right? Because you could make films on a very small budget, but small in those days meaning, yeah, still quite substantial, $6 million, and you didn't need to appeal to a mass audience. You can appeal to a niche audience, yeah? You can say, well, you know, kind of gay men, or people, or black people, yeah, or, yeah, that's only 10% of the population. You can still make films for those people through the video sales that had heretofore not been part of the financing of films. So in relation to Almodóvar, kind of, you know, all of his films from this moment on got a video release in the United States specifically addressed to a gay market. Yeah? So within Spain, he'd gone from being underground, but underground at a moment where the underground culture was the national youth culture. Yeah, kind of, this did not last forever, but in this particular period, right, with the dictator dying, the moment of transition, yeah, the hopes for democracy, this kind of underground was the youth culture of the day. So, you know, he goes from being underground in Spain, but underground in a mainstream way that brings in together all of the youth culture. He goes on in a very brief period to becoming the most financially successful filmmaker in Spain. Yeah, but then he also has this whole other career, yeah, with associations specifically to gay cinema all over North America in a way that made many things possible for him. Does that make sense? Yeah? So it's almost like two different identities conjoined, yeah, but in different places. And one being the national and the other one being the international. And all of it made possible to a large extent through what the coming of video cassette sales made possible. Okay, so he made Matador in 1986, and then the film I want to spend a little bit of time on is The Law of Desire. Again, you know, the budgets keep increasing, and each of his films become even more successful, right? So this is a very significant film. Well, it's the first Almodóvar film I saw, yeah, so that's not why it's significant or important. But it's the first film that Almodóvar produced by his own production company. So from this moment in 1986 until now, he's produced all his films. Yeah, he owns them all. They're his. He can do whatever he wants with them, right? I mean, he gets grants from the government as other film producers do, but he's like, he's more financially independent than someone like Woody Allen, yeah? He pays for his films, he hires his actors, yeah, kind of. And this is from this moment. And now, again, I think one of the things that I want to underline as a kind of a characteristic rather than as a context for Almodóvar is how brave he is, yeah, like courage, really, because, you know, this is his first film as a producer. He's gambling his career on this. And what is the film about? The film is a gay melodrama about one man who's in love with another man who's in love with another man, right? And this in 1986 in a country that, you know, hadn't been out of a dictatorship for, I mean, it was barely a decade, not even a decade since it had been out of a dictatorship. And actually, the very worst thing you could be during the Franco era was gay. Yeah, it was, you know, if you think of all the ideas of how a man should be and machismo and, you know, all of the discussions of the nation were about, you know, how to be a man. And, you know, to be gay was a betrayal of all of that. And it was very heavily punished, yes? Not only with jail sentences, but hard labor and so on. So, you know, Franco dies in 1975. This film comes out in 1987. And that is the thematic, really, of the film. Yeah, a kind of a gay triangle. And of course, paradoxically, it becomes the film that the government most supports, right? So when the film came out, I did this study, and this is the film that the Spanish state chose to most represented abroad that year. So, you know, if the state has a budget for marketing films and film festivals, this is the one that they chose, right? And of course, you have to ask yourself, why? Yeah? So something that is so forbidden and now is what the government most supports. And actually, it really has to do with the marketing of the nation, right? So during the Franco years, an excuse for the dictatorship was that Spain was different to the rest of Europe. Yeah? And actually, that was a motto of its tourist campaigns. Yeah? So, you know, it's actually a byline, a marketing buzzword. Spain is different. They would put that on the posters, you know, with those famous pictures of the sun and the bulls, yeah? And so on. So the reason why the state supported this film was because it wanted to demarcate that Spain was now different from what it had been in the dictatorship. And what was the biggest marker of Spain's difference from the dictatorship? Homosexuality, yeah? So kind of, you know, you could be gay in Spain. Spain is now different than what it was, right? And I mean, it wasn't quite true. I mean, in relation to the society as a whole, there were still kind of, much oppression and many difficulties, but it was very useful and a very good shorthand for the government to signal what their aspirations were, how they wanted to be seen, what the difference from the previous regime had been. And this was actually kind of, the best marketing tool for it, and a great stroke of luck for Almodóvar himself, But though that explains the circulation of the film abroad, with this massive support from the Spanish government, it doesn't explain its success internally, right? This was the second most successful film in Spain of the whole year, right? So in spite of the subject matter, it's a film that popular Spanish audiences of the period took to in a way that would not necessarily continue to be the case, right? Because I think for some audiences in Spain at least, Almodóvar is a kind of problem, in the sense that many of the things that we like about him, the queerness, the transsexuals, the humor with the drugs and so on, is actually something that people say, it makes some people upset. Here's Spain's most popular filmmaker, sometimes the only one that is known, right? And now it's kind of associated with these things that they would prefer kind of Spain not to be associated with. Before I let go of this film, just to mention a characteristic of Almodóvar, I think, one of the very beautiful and subtle things that he does in the cinema, and that you see evident here. Well, two things, actually. Three. Central to the story is Jean Cocteau's La Voix Humaine, the one-act monologue in which a woman is talking on the phone to the lover who's leaving her, right? It gets played out in the film by Carmen Maura. The film is very interesting in the sense that Carmen Maura plays the transsexual, right? So you have, and forgive me if I'm using the wrong language, but you have a biological woman playing the transsexual, and then you have one of the most famous transsexuals in Spain, Bibi Anderson, who's named after Bergman's actress, playing the biological mother of a little girl, right? And you also see that in the attribution of characteristics. So Antonio Banderas plays this man overwhelmed by desire, but from a right-wing family, and also very macho. So you have all of the characteristics that you associate with machismo attributed to the gay character, and then, the person who's sensitive, who's aware of feelings, who's very kind, that's actually attributed to the heterosexual character, So in Almodóvar's films, to be gay is not necessarily to be good, right? But also, it's a way of redistributing characters that makes you rethink whatever you might think is the essence of something, there are very few essences in Almodóvar's films, And a way of redistributing these characteristics is a way of making you rethink these categories, and opening up possibilities. All right? So a very significant film for all of these ways. And I'm going to rush a little bit because we're still only in 1980, and he's basically making a film a year or every 2 years until now. But I also wanted to signal that these films, as popular as they were not well received critically, okay? If you go through the Spanish press, the newspaper reviews, the magazine reviews, they're very critical of Almodóvar. He's not considered a good filmmaker. Now, partly it's because, though I would argue that he's always a good storyteller, he actually wasn't a good filmmaker in this period, right? Part of the pleasure of watching these films is to see how Almodóvar becomes a great director, how he learns to use the medium. I mean, there's a sense in which you watch a film like Bad Education, and there are some shots that are just so beautiful, and they're expressive, and the framing is telling you something about the story, right? In these early films, you don't get any of that. I think he hasn't quite yet become a great director in terms of his use of the medium. So that was part of the problem. But part of the problem also had to do with a very narrow critical consensus on what a good film is, right? So in Spain, in the 1980s, the idea of a good film was the cinema of Carlos Sauda, primarily, and of Victor Erice. Now, they're both great filmmakers. I mean, The Spirit of the Beehive is one of my all-time favorite films. But it's an art cinema. It's very hermetic, right? It was very allegorical. Yeah, those were films that in a way told stories during the dictatorship in a way that the censors couldn't understand, right? So they were very elliptical, allegorical, yeah, kind of, they required unraveling and interpreting, right? I mean, part of the fun of going to these films was coming out and talking to your friends about what it meant, right? Almodóvar is the opposite of that. Yeah, he's direct. You know where you stand immediately, and he's got this great facility to make audiences feel, right? So, but if this is the only model, yeah, of good cinema, then clearly Almodóvar's wasn't like that, right? And there was also another thing, that there was a very narrow conception of authorship, right? So, I mean, there are many definitions of authorship. Yeah, perhaps the most banal one is, that films are the work of one person, yeah, which of course is never true, right? And that one person expresses themselves and their consciousness kind of through the stories that they tell. And through that definition of authorship, Almodóvar could not be considered a great director because everybody in the milieu knew that he was homosexual, and yet it was only when he made The Law of Desire that he treated the topic directly, right? So kind of his initial public closetedness, yeah, because I don't think he was that way in his ordinary life, was also a barrier to him being considered, a great auteur, a great artist in film. Does that make sense? Do you understand that? Yeah? All right. Now, I'm going to show you just 2 minutes from Labyrinth of Passion. It's from 1982, just to indicate like how brave and how daring this was, and how shocking. Now, it might not look to us, it might not look like that to us now, yeah. But just have a look. These are just the opening shots of A Labyrinth of Passion. They take place in the Rastro, which is the flea market, yeah, in Madrid that happens every Sunday. You might also want to look at how poor the culture was. If you just look at the streets, the sidewalks, yeah, and if any of you know Madrid now, you can see, yeah, how the country has changed. Cecilia Roth, who played the mother in All About My Mother, is the star of this also. And it's with Imanol Arias, and this is how it begins. Okay, that's all I need you to see, right? Now, it might not seem very much to you, but think, right? Kind of one of the most famous articles in all of film studies is Laura Mulvey arguing about the male look, that the woman is always the subject of the look, yeah? The kind of women are not allowed to look. And they're the subject of three relays of male looks, right? Well, here the film begins not only with a woman looking, yeah, and a woman looking sexually, but a woman looking at crotches, right? Very kind of direct. And not only that, but then if you think that the film is going to make the women the man's equal, or it's going to make, you know, the women the man, then you would expect the man to be doing the same to women, right? But no, instead he's also looking at crotches, right? Yeah, at male crotches. So kind of 40 years ago, and maybe still today actually, yeah, this is kind of quite an extraordinary way to begin a film, yeah? And this is typically what Almodóvar was doing in this period. I want to, again, just underline that, you know, there was an attempted coup in 1981, right? So, whereas we tend to see this freedom to represent as something that's a given, yeah, that Spain, yeah, is a democracy, you could show these things. And of course, you could only show these things because Spain was a democracy. But Spain was a very shaky democracy in this period, right? There was no guarantee, yeah, the kind of, you know, the Constitution had only come in 78, and of course in 1981, there was a famous attempted coup, yeah, to revert things back to a dictatorship, right? So Almodóvar making these films with this subject matter in this way, yeah, is a real, it's very brave, it's very courageous, and a great personal risk, yeah? Had things turned around, he'd be dead, yeah? Or certainly serving a very long and arduous jail sentence. All right. Now, I just wanted to show you this image. I hope that, you know, more of you had seen What Have I Done to Deserve This, because what you see, even in this early cinema, is the sensibility of someone who really knows and feels for how images work. So Gloria is this downtrodden housewife, and often she's filmed from inside her appliances, right? So in this instance, she doesn't have enough food to feed her children, just a little chicken leg that's a bit burnt and that goes to the husband, right? But you can see that she's filmed from inside the oven, inside the washing machine, yeah? And of all of these appliances that are meant to free women's labor, but actually don't free Gloria, right? And these are just some of the things that if you see Almodóvar cinema, become very beautiful, very moving, very telling, right? And almost like we have to train ourselves to see them because we feel them, yeah? It's part of the reason why you feel a particular way when you see these films is because you unconsciously understand what these choices signify, right? But it's kind of good to be alert to them. Why is he filming from inside the oven? What does that say? Or inside the washing machine? Or in The Law of Desire, yes, you know, he has a conversation with the man he loves, and the two faces look at each other, yes, in the split screen. He has a conversation with the guy he doesn't love, who's after him, and they're shown looking in different directions, right? So kind of these simple little choices of showing are very significant, very beautiful, very moving, and express a lot. Okay. We're still only in 1988, so I'm going to race through much of the rest. But I wanted to linger a little bit on this film, yeah, because it's still, as of today, the most popular film in the whole history of Spanish cinema, right? It made the top 10. It was the most successful film 2 years in a row in Spain. In America, in the United States, it was the most financially successful foreign film since Fellini's 8½, what is this, 1964 or 65 or something like that, right? So it was an enormous success both at home and abroad, and is a kind of a marker, right? So from this point onwards, his cinema would change, right? there was a period where he really had to figure out what kind of cinema he was making. Like every career, it has peaks and troughs, right? But this is an apotheosis, yeah? That the film would come from the underground, who was showing all these shocking things, who people thought he was just popular because he was shocking, yeah? All of a sudden is really the most financially popular filmmaker of all time from Spain. Yeah? And I want to show you a little clip from that film. Okay, let me just pause it for a moment. Because Almodóvar is a filmmaker who is also a cinephile, yeah? You know, who loves cinema and who uses cinema and who sometimes uses clips from other filmmakers to convey something that they express, but also something different or something new, right? And it's not just used as an in-joke, as something that cinephiles will recognize. It's very much used to express feeling as well. And he does it in a very beautiful way, and he's done it from the beginning. You know, and if you see later films like Broken Embraces is like a film about cinema, right? It begins with an eye opening, right? And it deals with sound and, you know, how sound is used and so on. But this is a small example of, you know, how he uses it very early on. So the Carmen Maura character has been left by her boyfriend, right? She's found out she's pregnant. She's desperate to get in touch with him to tell him the news. But of course, he's avoiding her and he doesn't want to answer. They're both dubbers. They both work. They're both actors who make a large part of their living dubbing foreign films. Yeah. And this is an instance where they're dubbing Nicholas Ray's Johnny Guitar. I don't know if you know it. It has the most romantic dialogue. Yeah. And then the film ends with a little homage to Hitchcock, yeah, from Strangers on a Train. And he will do this constantly, yeah? So this is the clip.
Toma, bebe.
No tengo sed.
Con esto conseguirás dormir.
Ya lo intenté. Y no me sirvió de nada.
¿A cuántos hombres has tenido que olvidar?
A tantos como mujeres recuerdas tú.
No te vayas.
No me he movido.
Dime algo agradable.
Sí. ¿Qué quieres que te diga?
Engáñame. Dime que siempre me has esperado. Dímelo.
Todos estos años te he esperado.
Dime que te hubieras muerto si no vuelvo.
Estaría muerta si no hubieras vuelto.
Dime que aún me quieres como yo te quiero.
Aún te quiero tanto como tú a mí.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.
Okay, that's the Hitchcock. Do you remember, yeah, when the young girl gets murdered in the amusement park, you have this shot like this from her glasses, which is what remains. Now, just to unpack this a little bit for you, right? You know, why is it so beautiful? Well, because it's as soon as the machine starts and you have the overshot head with the light, yeah, it's almost, you're entering another realm of feeling, yeah? So it's not plot here. It's kind of, yeah, it's a world of feeling that the film takes you to. And then, of course, it's made more expressive because this very, very famous dialogue from Johnny Guitar with Joan Crawford. She's voicing the Joan Crawford part, but it's her boyfriend who's missing, who she's dying to get in touch with, who's telling her all these things she wants to hear, yeah, but can't anymore from him. That's voicing the other part, right? And then, of course, the reality of the situation is ruptured physically in an embodied way, because, of course, part of the reason why she faints is she's pregnant, yeah, kind of with him. So just a very small example of really kind of quite sophisticated and moving and beautiful and complex things with a hint of humor that Almodóvar was already kind of doing, I don't know, what is it now, 30 years ago, right? And I do think he gets better and better and better. All right, so erase here a little bit. Okay, so after Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, he had a period where these films were still enormously successful, maybe less artistically realized, yeah? Trying to find a way of making different types of films. Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down is very important in North American film history because it broke the X barrier, yeah? There were court cases fought about not giving the film an X, and Miramax, who was the distributor in America, won. Tacones Lejanos is High Heels. It's based on a Cirque melodrama, imitation of life. Cirque is one of the filmmakers that Almodóvar loves. I should mention here that another absolutely important contribution from Almodóvar was the, he didn't discover it, but the making popular of singers singing in Spanish from all over the Spanish-speaking world, right? So there was a period in the mid-late 90s where compilations of songs from Almodóvar films were, you know, top 10 hits in Spain and all over Latin America. And if you go on Spotify, you can see Almodóvar, yeah, listed as albums, right? And the rediscovery of these singers, often from the 1950s. I'm thinking Bola de Nieve and people like that. Now, what you also have here with this increasing success is a move from the national into which can only be called a European. What you have is, you know, Almodóvar now kind of bringing in kind of all kinds of artists. Jean-Paul Gaultier did the dress for Kika, yeah, and Europe becomes an issue, a theme in a lot of his films. So, you know, in Live Flesh, building the Kia Towers, which are also called the Towers of Europe, is, you know, one of the main themes of the film. So this kind of shift from the national, which always remains national, the films are always in many ways about Spanish issues, but kind of Spain now in the context of Europe, in a broader context, is something that you begin to see in this period. Okay. There's a shift in The Flower of My Secret with Marisa Paredes about, you know, a woman who writes best-selling romances. And from here on, you get kind of, I think, an enormous period of creativity where after this, you have Live Flesh, then you have All About My Mother, then you have Talk to Her, right? Which kind of critically kind of people see as almost like, you know, one masterpiece after another in cinematic terms. Yeah, and this is from Broken Embraces. And I think the point I want to make is that if you see his cinema as a body of work, it's kind of, it's actually unlike even, you know, some of the most celebrated auteurs that you can recognize their style, yeah, the way the films look and the way the films move and their themes. Because one of the things that Almodóvar does, like a 19th century novel, I'm thinking specifically of Trollope, yeah, which I'm not assuming that you've read, but if you read Trollope's 19th century novels, what you'll find is that in one novel, you know, somebody's the protagonist, yeah? In another novel, they play a small role in somebody's story, right? Or stories get reworked. And what you have, for example, in Almodóvar is that a small incident in The Law of Desire, yeah? There's a bit in the film where the transsexual person goes to talk to the priest who'd abused her, yeah, as a young boy. That little scene that's kind of played for humor, in a way, in The Law of Desire, becomes all of the movie of bad education. And in bad education, it's played for tragedy. This violation, you know, ruptures a child in half, ruins his life, yeah, and so on. And this, in turn, gets replayed again in a different way in Pain and Glory, right? And that's just one example. If you go through all of his films, you'll see, yeah, these links. So, you know, an element of Kika, character in Kika, becomes kind of more important, and you get more of their story in The Skin I Live In, right? So it's one of the ways in which kind of Almodóvar's work is kind of unique, and it comes from the independence that he has to do whatever he wants. That he's obviously reworking kind of personal concerns in a way that sometimes feels autobiographical, but some ways you can see is kind of an autofiction rather than autobiography, you know, but that is always kind of very personal, and you see that change of the perception on that past event through the way that it gets reworked in at different times, yeah, throughout his career. But also the process of feeling that you need to rework it, that you haven't quite come to terms with it, that it gets represented over and over and over again. It's one of the fascinating things about Almodóvar. And this example is just an example of this kind of auto-referentiality. So in Broken Embraces, which is a film about cinema, right? And the star is a director who's now blind, yeah? So can't see. He can only write stories now. He can't direct. But he'd made this film in the past that had been sabotaged by the producer, right? And they find this out and they re-edit it. And through the editing, they make this disaster into a success. And of course, the film that they're working on is Woman on the Verge of Nervous Breakdown, right? It's the same story, right? That they're reworking, but now kind of reworking in a different context. So rather than it being the most successful Spanish film of all time, it's the film that led to the death of a career, but you have the dialogue and scenes and so on, now played by Penelope Cruz instead of Carmen Maura, right? And played in a completely different key in this film that was made like 25 years later, right? This is just an example of some of the things that Almodóvar does. I'm going to bring it to a close, but I just want to go through some things. I made this list of things that I thought were important and that I didn't want to forget telling you. So forgive the repetition. So the first thing, as I hope it's clear, is, you know, the religious education and the peasant backgrounds. You see it, you know, you can't imagine Dark Hideouts, yeah, the film about the nuns, or Bad Education, or Pain and Glory, without, yeah, that context. The Franco years and the period of transition is very important. Oh, sorry. Is very important. The Movida of the late 70s, early 80s, and the ramifications of that, the cost of that, yeah, kind of, you know, AIDS and heroin, the effects of all of that. One of the things I haven't mentioned is advertising culture and TV, right? One of the things that you see often in his films is a satire on commercials, TV commercials, right? You know, which aim to sell you coffee, but end up scarring you for life, played for a laugh, right? Or a detergent that's so good that it gets rid of all of the blood of your serial killer's son. Right? Those kinds of things appear in almost all of his early films. And very interestingly, kind of the older he got, in a way the more serious, yeah, the less you have of that. And, you know, some audiences see that as a fault, as a loss, yeah, that you're missing these moments. I wanted to mention his cinephilia, you know, but also how culture more broadly inspires and is a jumping point for his films, right? So when you see All About My Mother, you see that a staging of A Streetcar Named Desire is a really absolutely kind of critical point in the whole film, yeah? So he's someone who reads, who's involved with theater, as well as being very knowledgeable of cinema, and he uses that in his films in ways that become kind of, that have depth and meaning. The 1950s style of cinema is absolutely critical to his work, yeah? Cinema, to me, can be great in a million different ways, yeah? There isn't a single recipe or form or, yeah? But there is something about 1950s film by the great metteur en scène, by Otto Preminger and Hitchcock and Vincenzo Minnelli, that is so precise that every camera moves something, that if the curtains are yellow, it means something, right? And this is the kind of cinema that Almodóvar does. And one of the ways that you see it is through his use of popular culture and art in his films. Because as his trajectory develops, you have, in Papier de Thibaume, you have posters for Superman and Wonder Woman and comic books and, what have I done to deserve this? One of the characters hails a taxi with a Barbie doll, right? But then you have, The Skin I Live in which the work of Louise Bourgeois becomes absolutely central to what the film is kind of trying to do and signify. And again, if you see a painting, the way that Almodóvar uses art in background is always very meaningful, very significant, kind of very moving. In fact, there are very beautiful, well, not very beautiful, very illuminating video essays online, if you go on YouTube, demonstrating how Almodóvar uses art throughout the course of his career. So a lot of his work is biographical, or it draws on his life. He's a great proselytizer for popular culture. Yeah, he's in love with popular culture, he's a fan. The stars of his youth are often used very provocatively and intelligently in his films. So for example, Sara Montiel, who was like the big star of Spanish cinema during the Franco years, gets referenced over and over and over again in his cinema. He's a great actor's director, and you can periodize his cinema by the relationship with those actors. So, throughout the 80s, it's Carmen Maura. Then in the 90s, you have a whole series of films with Victoria Abril and Marisa Paredes. And then recently, you had a whole series of films with Penelope Cruz. And of course, Antonio Banderas recurs throughout his filmography over and over again. Yeah. But if you pay attention, you'll also see that all the bit parts, the telephone repairman in Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown has a tiny role as the husband of, or the brother-in-law of the matador who was killed in Talk to Her, yeah? So all the little bit pieces are often played by friends or family or people he knows. I think there's a move from the national, to the European, which is with Almodóvar almost always international, and in that case is a unique instance in Spanish cinema. The film is not only queer in the broadest sense, but also is queering, yeah? So the example that I gave of the attribution of characteristics is an example of queering, yeah? And then kind of the workings and reworkings, and of course, themes that recur. They're always about love and loss and so on. But actually, the one that I would like to highlight, because I think it becomes so significant over time, is rape, yeah? In so many different forms, so many different manifestations, and to so many different effects, yeah? So I'd like to end this before we open up a discussion by just saying that to me, his great gift is to get audiences to feel, right? And to feel for those characters which the culture most despises, yeah? Which I think is a gift of its own. So actually, to get someone to feel for a character is already an enormous gift. But to get someone to feel and understand for those which the culture despises is an even greater gift. And this is something that Almodóvar has done right from the beginning, kind of, this incredible gift to get audiences to feel for what they're seeing on screen. And when that doesn't happen, like in Bad Education, there's always a reason, yeah? why isn't he allowing you to identify, to laugh with, or feel with these characters? Why is there this distance? Yeah? In the rare films that happens, you can see that it's deliberate, and it raises all kinds of questions. Okay? And this might be a good moment to raise some kinds of questions from you. All right? So thank you.
Počkejte na mikrofon, aby to slyšeli paní překladatelky a mohli to přeložit. If you have any questions, please speak into the mic.
And the questions can be about anything, because I'm conscious that there are entire areas of the career that I haven't touched on, so do feel free.
Hello.
Hi.
Could you go back to the... Hello?
Yeah?
Could you go back to the love triangle slide?
Okay.
I was just wondering if you happen to know who did the artwork for that, the love, yeah, that.
That?
Yeah.
No. I mean, I do know, but I can't remember the name, yeah? I think it's Giuseppe, but I'm not sure. But what is very important about this is the way that it was marketed. So if you see the Italian poster and the French poster, they're all different. Yeah, the French poster is just a pillow on a bed, right? So the love desire could be anything, right? Yeah, and that is something that's very important to Almodóvar, because what I didn't mention is that throughout this period he designs all his own press packages. Yeah, and they would be very beautiful. Right, so it would be hard cardboard with a lush image, right? Yeah, so always something very appealing, just the package itself. But then when you open it, he would often write the copy, right? So this is like control freak director, right? That he wants to control how the films are perceived on initial release, right? So he will tell you the main themes of this film, XXX, right? The influences, XXX. And then it's very interesting because you read the reviews and you realize that 80% of it comes, yeah, from this press package. They're all saying the same thing, yeah, and partly because, well, it's so well written and it's so enticing, and it might be things that the reviewer hadn't thought of, right? But they're a fascinating thing on its own, just the press packages. That's not your question, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name. Uh-huh.
My English is very bad, so I will speak in Czech.
No problem.
Vy jste zmiňoval mnohé spolupracovníky Pedra Almodóvara, ale nezmínil jste jednoho, a to je skladatel Alberto Iglesias. A mě by zajímalo, od které doby vlastně spolupracovali, jaký mají spolu vztah mezi sebou, tedy ten čistě pracovní především, a jak vlastně ho Pedro Almodóvar objevil a jakým způsobem podle vás právě Iglesias vyvolává v lidech ty emoce. Děkuju, thank you.
Yes, I think he's worked with Iglesias since the 80s. Iglesias is part of the core group of people because, again, I was watching an interview with Christopher Nolan, right? And Christopher Nolan is talking about Oppenheimer, and he's very careful to credit the composer, the cameraman, the costume designer, the scenic designer. Every director knows that they cannot produce a story without all of these very important collaborators. And with Almodóvar, I think with Iglesias, he's remained with Iglesias, almost entirely throughout the career. Whereas with his cinematographers, he casts them, right? So, he chooses one cinematographer for this. José Luis Alcaine is the one that recurs most often. He's always had the same head of production in all of his films, right? Now, about feeling, yes and no, yeah? I think music is always complex in film, right? Because, you know, you've heard the concept of like Mickey Mousing, yeah? You don't want a Mickey Mouse. You actually don't want an audience to feel something just because you drum, right? Or you over-signal what an audience should feel, yeah? So it's a complex kind of collaboration of which Almodóvar is in complete control. I mean, you know, if he would not want a particular score or the score of a particular moment, he wouldn't have it. He has that control. On the other hand, these are trusted collaborators that he's worked over and over again, and he's worked with them over and over again because they bring something so beautiful to his films, as indeed, you know, Iglesias does, because, you know, fans of Almodóvar's films are often like, you know, people who will play the score, Iglesias score, just for the sheer enjoyment of it, right? But that is not necessarily a good thing in a film. You don't want the music to overshadow the story. You want the music to serve the story, right? And I think that's what Iglesias' music does in his films. Yeah, okay.
Yes, thank you so much. And first of all, I really want to thank you for all knowledge and information you shared with us. It's really amazing, and thank you so much. And my question is about your actual love affair with Almodóvar. Like, where or how did you work? I mean, like, where did you meet with his work for the first time, or how it all has begun?
Okay, thank you. I saw Love, Desire was the first film of his that I've seen. So my parents are Spanish, but I'm one of those people who emigrated. I emigrated to Canada when I was 7. So I grew up in Montreal, in Canada. And the first film of his that I saw was The Law of Desire. Right? And I'm a gay man, and I had never seen anything like that, like this film. Right? We forget how little representation there was. And also, you know, how the culture itself had been, yeah, in a bit of change, really, because, you know, if you look previously, you have the films of Visconti and Pasolini and Fassbinder, right? You know, but some of them needed, or Derek Jarman. But, you know, Derek Jarman was like, yeah, art cinema, experimental cinema, that period. You know, Visconti was mainstream, but needed deciphering and, you know, kind of, it's really only Death in Venice, well, and The Conversation that have, you know, that as an explicit thing. Of course, Fassbinder was in a case by himself, right? But I would argue that Fassbinder did the type of cinema that the AIDS pandemic put a stop to, right? So, and certainly in my context growing up, there was very little representation, and what you were having from Hollywood was things like Making Love, right? They're just like so uptight and conservative, right? So here I was, you know, a Spanish immigrant thinking that Spain was so old-fashioned and retrograde and fascist and, yeah, and yet it made, you know, the film that seemed to be most open and romantic and so on, yeah, was a Spanish film. So that's, you know, I thought, who is this person, right? And then in those days I was the editor of Cinema Canada, the national film magazine in Canada, and I went to the Toronto Film Festival. And I think by 1988, the Toronto Film Festival already did a retrospective of Almodóvar's films, right? And when you see Pepe, Labyrinth of Passion, Dark, all in a row, I mean, it's just, you know, to someone in that period, it was mind-boggling. You had never seen anything like it before, right? So then I went to Spain and interviewed him, yeah, and that's how it began. And then I've been writing more or less ever since on him, really. And yeah, following him very closely.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful lecture. Very appreciated. My question is, I've mentioned in many Almodóvar films, and I've seen many, certain critique of mass media or TV personalities, how their works. I mean, the main character, or the second main character in Kika, Victoria Abreu's in Jean-Paul Gaultier dress. It's all about the critique of the reality show, and but there are mentions of this in other films, like Talk to Her, the interview with Lydia de Tourade, or in I don't remember the movie, but
Talk to Her.
talk to her, and the other, I mean, in Volver, this scene where with the cancer, and it's really critical how the TV personalities work with his people who are interviewed. Is it something? Do you think is it something personal with Almodóvar? Thank you.
I don't know if it's personal. I think it's an observation, because if you go online, you'll see that in the early 1980s, Almodóvar constantly appears on television. It's one of the ways he was famous. And he appears in television both in the underground, hip music, midnight shows, but he also appears in homages to Lola Flores, the star, right? Like, in Spain they would do things where, they would take a star and then they would bring all these other stars to sing to her or perform for her as a kind of an homage, an appreciation, a thank you. And you have Almodóvar appear in those as well, right? So he's a fixture of television, and I think he understands its power. But I think there's no question that he absolutely despises a certain kind of, I don't know if I want to say cheap television, but reality television, exploitative television, television that is like tabloid journalism, right, that brings in someone to exploit. There's a lot of that in Spain, right? Like, there's a lot of celebrity television, so all of those things that you see in Almodóvar's films are jokes. They're meant to be funny, but there is a real critique of that type of television, The woman in the film that you're speaking of, when Lydia goes to the channel and the woman just wants to talk about her affair with a bullfighter and won't let her leave the chair, right? So it's a joke, but Spanish celebrity television is like that, It's kind of crude and nasty, and they pay people to appear to embarrass themselves. I think every country has different television, which is in some ways why television cultures are so different to talk about cross-culturally, right? But you see these almost everywhere, you see this in American television, even British television, which has like this reputation of the BBC and so on. You have the Jeremy Kyle show where you bring in like sub-proletariats to basically humiliate themselves, for the opportunity of being on television. It's really awful, right? So yes, it's a critique. Anyone else?
I want to thank you for the lecture also. And I wanted to ask you about The Human Voice,
yes.
The short film with Tilda Swinton, and how does it work in the context of his other films, and should we expect more English-speaking films now from him?
Well, we have one. What is it called? The cowboy one with, I'm getting old and I forget the names, but there's another short film which is a little bit like Brokeback Mountain.
Oh, the new one was in Cannes this year?
That's right,
yeah.
I haven't seen it yet. So he's made 2 short films. Well, he's made many more, but recently he's made these 2 films. And The Human Voice, I think, and indeed this one, with Pedro Pascal and
Ethan Hawke, I think.
Ethan Hawke, they're actually almost kind of a little bit, I think, reworkings of concerns, right? So I was saying how, someone could write a fascinating essay just on The Human Voice, right? There's the Cocteau play, there's the Rossellini film with Anna Magnani, written by Fellini, which is one of those components. Ingrid Bergman did it on television. Simone Signoret did it, right? It's like all the great actresses of a particular period have done this. Then you have Carmen Maura doing it for Almodóvar, and then you have Penelope Cruz doing it again for Almodóvar, right? And then you have Almodóvar doing it again, but in English with Tilda Swinton, right? My own feeling is that I admire the film, but actually I don't like it very much, the Tilda Swinton version. It somehow feels that, the Britishness kind of brings a kind of a distance in the manner of speaking, in the briskness of speaking. I think the language itself that, it's interesting because it doesn't jive with my appreciation of the work, which is this outpouring of feeling from this woman. Yeah, the desperation, this loss. You always feel with Tilda that she's not really on the verge of a nervous breakdown, that she'll have a cup of tea and be okay. It's my feeling. What's yours?
I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, you haven't seen it? Okay. Oh, no, well, I think it's, for me, it's always worth watching, yeah? And also, I don't want to be dismissive of it, because the other thing with Almodóvar that I think is so interesting, I've been watching them almost all my life now, and you come to different films at different points in your life, and you remember what you initially felt, but also your feelings change, and your understanding changes. Yeah, so I would encourage people to see it.
Thank you.
Just another word about that. I'm very glad that Almodóvar never made a Hollywood film. Yeah, I think not through any prejudice, but I think to Spanish-speaking people, one of the great glories of that cinema is the language, the way of speaking, the phrases, right? And he would never be able to do that in English, right? And also it would be a loss to Spanish-speaking cultures, plural, right? So I'm glad he's stuck with making films in the Spanish language. Yeah. I've noticed with other directors, by the way, so a classic Hollywood director, if you watch Siodmak's films, which I adore, right? The film noirs, The Killers, and Crisscross. But when you watch his German language films, he can do things that don't appear in his American films. He's a lot funnier, yeah? And, his jokes, the relationships that he demonstrates, yeah, all have a different feel than his Hollywood films because he understands the language and its uses. Yeah, so I think there's always, if you're a foreign director in Hollywood, you gain something, but you lose something, And why lose something when you don't need to? Yeah? So I'm glad Almodóvar stayed in Spain. All right? Perhaps one last question, if there's any? No? Well, in that case, thank you so much for staying here with me until the very end. I appreciate it. Thank you.